Hello. I was a fine art student at Newcastle University in the 1960s when the artist Richard Hamilton supervised the disassembly of the Elterwater Merz Barn relief and its removal to the Hatton Gallery. Those events sparked my interest in Schwitters, although for many years my understanding of the relief and the artist's intentions was a rather superficial one. I realized only later, when reading the extensive Schwitters literature in a more than casual way, that the last Merz Barn had received much less critical analysis and attention than, say, its Hanover predecessor. The reasons were probably ones of the Merz Barn's incompletion and assumptions that because Schwitters' creative objectives are therefore only partially revealed, it's resistant to thorough critical investigation. Of course, the legacy also persists of those less than glowing earliest critical accounts of Schwitters' practice in the UK, stating that perhaps for practical, emotional, and psychological reasons, the quality of his artistic and literary work deteriorated in the final years of exile, losing the vitality and creative edge which it had particularly demonstrated in the 1920s. When reading such accounts, it's as though Schwitters' heroic period, that's to say the 1920s, still provided the most reliable yardstick against which to assess the quality, nature, and intentionality of much of his late work, and especially the Merz Barn. It's as though, for some writers and critics, the Barn's organic and curvilinear language proved an uneasy and less than acceptable divergence from the tidy orthodoxies of post-Cubist analysis, which for so long has provided a familiar and reliable linchpin for interpretations of the modernist project. Much of the Merz Barn literature inevitably references context of the work's placement in a rural environment and Lakeland's perhaps inevitable impact on the artwork's formal characteristics. Surprisingly, that's surprising for an artist whose mature practice is often regarded as archetypically urban. Observers sometimes ascribe the Barn's flows and arabesques as a response mainly to its rustic physical context, Schwitters' lifelong enthusiasm for vitalist aesthetics, and maybe as passing references to the work of several of his contemporaries, perhaps Hans Arp, a great friend of his, Kandinsky, or even Miro, Moore, Barbara Hepworth, and so on. Those stylistic influences, if they may be termed as such, are no doubt also consistent with what I'd call the magpie instinct, which informed the entirety of Schwitters' career, and his persistent and almost uncanny ability throughout his life to assimilate and represent the spirit or zeitgeist of his times. Arguably, by the 1940s, Schwitters' health and practical circumstances were such that his impetus was simply to survive, and that he'd have had little time, opportunity, or inclination to attend to the subtleties of international art practice, as had been the case in earlier decades. Peculiarly, those wartime circumstances did not inhibit one of the most productive periods of his artistic career. I'll therefore attempt in this talk to place Schwitters and his late work within the complex social, cultural, and political matrix within which he found himself during the last decade of his life, particularly those years immediately following World War II, before the advent of the Cold War and a subsequent repoliticization of leading contemporary art in the West as a tool for the propaganda of democracy, primarily in America, but also in the UK. I shall attempt to outline that many of the decidedly non-urban characteristics displayed in the Merz Barn and in his late abstract paintings and sculptures owe less of a debt to Schwitters' immediate physical and emotional environment than they do to a remarkable and continued ability, as I've said, to embody the cultural zeitgeist. The Merz Barn, I'll argue, can more readily be assessed and understood by examining it within contexts of international contemporary art in the mid-1940s. Immediate post-war art practice and theory, both now largely overlooked subjects, they provide a key, as it were, which begins to unlock, I'll argue, the language of the last Merz Barn. John Elderfield's otherwise definitive and inspiring 1985 biography of Schwitters surprisingly devoted little more than 3 pages to the Merz Barn. Elderfield's sparse closing remarks on the Merz Barn, well, perhaps knowingly, they highlighted certainly an imperative for further research. Elderfield said, it is a softly primitive cave whose walls grow like plants to the light, beginning to assume those serpentine forms characteristic of the Lake District landscape. The envisaged effect of the whole appears to have been a kind of roughness and sudden variation joined to irregularity, typical of picturesque taste, and, it must be said, limited by it. Well, I'd say it's debatable that forms characteristic of the actually quite rugged Elterwater landscape can be described as serpentine. It's also debatable, I'd say, that Schwitters' Merz Barn is typical of picturesque taste. Now, the biomorphic 40s. The Biomorphic 40s was the title of the English art critic and curator Lawrence Alloway's 1965 Art Forum essay, which aimed to retrospectively summarize the creative intentionalities of a decade. Alloway's subject was the fluid, organic shapes in the work of American painters such as Arshile Gorky, the early Jackson Pollock, the early Mark Rothko, which are placed securely within context of the work of European artists such as Hans Juan Miro and Vasily Kandinsky. They, of course, were artists associated with abstraction and surrealism, and argued Allaway, with traditions which predated them, particularly in Germany, where the term biomorphism had a resonance as a consequence of its evocation of romantic and vitalist traditions so firmly rooted in German philosophy. In his essay, Allaway initially identified such biomorphic traits in rather generalized ways, but he then proceeded to more specifically demonstrate his thesis with reference to an emergent New York art enthused by what he called a cluster of ideas about nature, automatism, mythology, and the unconscious. Allaway's outline of a biomorphism characterizing an emergent New York school in the mid-1940s nevertheless offered scant historical analysis of the source of this newfound enthusiasm, beyond that of the obvious influence on leading contemporary American art of several European artists, many at the time, obviously exiled in America. To begin to identify those sources more securely, it's necessary to refer to the vigorous debates in Europe and America about the role and future of culture, which marked especially the late 1940s and most of the 1930s. Of course, at a time of escalating international political crisis, the function of the arts was not a consuming social issue, although the debates were significant with respect to attempts to underline and define national cultural identities within both totalitarian and democratic regimes. This was as much the case in England and America as it was in Germany and elsewhere. The leading contenders were art theorists and artists, as much as they were politicians and bureaucratic apparatchiks. Now, modernism by the late 1930s was regarded by many as a spent force in Europe and as a failed project, partially by its own making, but also effectively killed or dispersed by Hitler and Stalin in favor of art forms believed to uphold more nationalist values. Conversely, theorists in the UK and America, such as Herbert Reed and Alfred Barr Jr., they were actively engaged in promoting interpretations of contemporary culture, which they thought were a reflection of primary characteristics defining democratic, non-totalitarian creativity and ideas. Both, as we know, were admirers of Schwitters. Reed was particularly supportive towards exiled artists in London and contributed a fulsome introduction to Schwitters' 1944 exhibition catalogue in Jack Bilbo's Modern Art Gallery. Barr's influence was instrumental in James Sweeney's funding for the Merz Barn, and Barr had included Schwitters in both of his seminal New York Museum of Modern Art exhibitions in 1936 and 1937. They were Cubism and Abstract Art and Fantastic Art, Dada and Surrealism. Reed and Barr were energetic promoters of biomorphic art practices. Reed, as a consequence of his theorization of an organic social aesthetic and his promotion of English artists, including Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth. Barr, in terms of his groundbreaking curatorial initiatives, which served as benchmarks for subsequent decades. And for his identification of a biomorphic genre in international contemporary art, which in 1936 he foresaw as a future and a hope for the failing European modernist project, especially in his native America. Now, a machine aesthetic, one of the earliest markers of modernism, was by the late 1930s widely believed to have failed, and Dada was viewed as a reflection of social and political complexities peculiar to the 1920s. Some believed that both had unwittingly contributed to the gruesome realities of right-wing extremism and the totalitarianism of the far left. In an ensuing scenario of total war, the arts, of course, were not a subject of major social and political concern. Discussion of the role of the arts was nevertheless a very passionate, if minor one, even leading Herbert Reed to observe in his wonderfully titled wartime essay, Modern Art and French Decadence, Reed said, "It's often thought and sometimes said that modern art, so largely centered in Paris, should long ago have been recognized as a symptom of the rot that was spreading to the Third Republic. Now that it only remains to carry out an autopsy on the dead body, symptoms no longer count. They can be dismissed as so much historical evidence of the process that was taking place, which has since run its course and has now come to a definite end. If Hitler is defeated, if a Fourth Republic rises from the ruins of the Third, then, say these critics, a new art, completely different from the art of the period entre-deux-guerres, will take shape and slowly establish itself." Well, they're very bold words, but what was the new art foreseen by pundits of the creative landscape? It was the English poet and cultural commentator Geoffrey Grigson, who in 1935 first used the term biomorphic in his article Comment on England in the magazine Axis. He made a distinction in the progressive visual arts of the period between what he termed non-geometric and geometric abstraction. According to Gregson, geometric abstraction seemed to have reached the end of its development, whereas non-geometric abstraction, or biomorphic art, was shaping a new and important developmental phase in art, in modern art. Gregson's ideas were quickly appropriated by Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In his groundbreaking 1936 exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art, which included 6 works by Schwitters, he attributed a trailblazing importance to biomorphic art and successfully assimilated Gregson's thesis concerning non-geometric and geometric abstraction, and produced his now legendary diagram on the exhibition catalogue's cover. Barr's schematic succinctly divided the paths taken by abstract art into 2 increasingly definitive strands. He defined the route taken by geometrical abstract art as one having commenced with Impressionism, being developed by Cézanne Cubism and Constructivism, and represented in 1936, for example, by Mondrian, Hefner, and Gobot. The developmental progress of non-geometrical abstract art, according to Barr, could be traced from Gauguin via Fauvism to the abstract expressionism of Kandinsky and the work of Miro, Arp, and more. Barr wrote, the non-geometric biomorphic forms of Arp and Moore are definitely in the ascendant. The formal tradition of Gauguin, Fauvism, and Expressionism will probably dominate for some time to come the tradition of Cézanne and Cubism. Of course, Barr's formula may today seem slightly perhaps simplistic, but the sincerity of his intentions to democratize and explain the complexities of contemporary art to an otherwise often confused and often very skeptical public, and the far-reaching influence of his approach, those things cannot be overemphasized. However, Barr's diagram, unlike his catalogue text, used non-geometric abstraction as his chosen term, rather than biomorphism, which was no doubt a consequence of the fact that artists working in that field in 1936 did not form a cohesive group, as had been the case, for example, with those Dadaists, Futurists, and Constructivists, for example, who had consistently outlined their objectives in pamphlets and manifestos. Artists working in biomorphic contexts invariably demonstrated heterogeneous formal languages and came from diverse artistic schools, Expressionism, Dada, Surrealism, so on. It's nonetheless apparent that, especially after 1936, a biomorphic style spread rapidly amongst artists and designers, and also began to inspire objects of everyday life. The popularity, for example, of kidney-shaped items of domestic furniture persisted into the 1950s. However, Barr's perhaps slightly pedantic use of the term non-geometric abstraction, or sometimes he called it impure abstraction, tended towards the non-interpretive, implying a condition of creativity dependent largely on its own internal laws and devoid of mediation by the objects of the world. It was the American art critic Meyer Shapiro, his passing remark in 1937 that biomorphic abstraction expressed a collapse of faith in the ethos of the machine, rather than Barr's rather clumsy halfway between the object and the thing represented, which illuminated the path for later discussion of the biomorphic genre. It'll be useful, before concluding, to outline the pervasiveness of a biomorphic style by the mid-1940s and its rapid decline as a cultural torchbearer for the forthcoming post-war age. In painting, American abstract expressionism may be viewed as an attempt to abandon the anthropocentric Renaissance tradition in favor of what in its early stages may be called a biocentric approach. The conviction, for example, of Jackson Pollock's 1944 statement to Hans Hofmann, where he said, "I am nature." I mean, that now seems very hollow when contrasted with his drive in 1949 and 1950 towards what he termed anti-nature, and what he termed a kind of writing, a script none of us has read before. Of course, Pollock's newfound willingness to disassociate himself from the rhythms and features of nature, they quickly made him a cause célèbre by 1950. He was soon to become the acceptable and heroic face of a newly Americanized avant-garde. His painting number 31 marked the closure of Pollock's biomorphic style in 1950. Pollock's reversal may be ascribed, as we mostly know, to the overwhelming critical influence in America and increasingly in Europe of Clement Greenberg, the premier theorist of an emergent American art which was quickly to dominate the cultures of Western democracies. Independence was a term for which Greenberg was to become the defining which for Greenberg was to become the defining feature of abstract expressionism, and it was a pathway of autonomy from Europe and European modernism that he believed provided the surest route for a newly Americanized avant-garde. In the immediate post-war years, at the beginning of the Cold War, and in America especially, the cultural requirement for a new and vigorous art form able to combat the threats of communism and socialist realism became an imperative. This would be an art which was strong, international, and big. An expression of individual freedom which simultaneously incorporated democratic values and, at least at face value, Western creativity's independence from political constraint. A new American art, in Greenberg's view, would withstand totalitarianism in ways which European modernism had signally failed to do. In such a scenario, Herbert Reed's vision of an organic aesthetic, grounded in the values of his aspired to anarchic democracy, seemed increasingly to have run its course. In post-war years, Reed persistently represented British culture as fragile and besieged, urging the Anglo-British to resist what was being thrust upon them by transatlantic cultural markets and European politics, and to return to their local resources. Reed became identified with an older cultural settlement as a consequence of the resistance he mounted to what he perceived to be the Americanization of the visual art. After an early burst of enthusiasm for de Kooning, he classified abstract expressionism as a form of nihilism. Now, Kurt Schwitters never used the term biomorphic himself. And biomorphism is still neither securely located in the roster of identifiable art movements or within the fields of art history and criticism. With the exception of hands-up, both adjectives were unused by Schwitter's contemporaries. And when they are now deployed to describe, say, the imagery of Arp, Moore, Miro, Hepworth, and some of the early abstract expressionists, generally without linkages, without examination of the linkages between those artists. Following the launch in 1931 of the international grouping Abstraction Creation, many leading artists then viewed the art of their time in terms of rival camps, the rival camps of surrealism and non-figurative art. Inevitably, as the decade progressed, that dichotomy impelled a more considered assessment and synthesis of artists such as Arp and Moore, who made works which were neither surrealistic nor fully abstract. That synthesis proved, however, to be insufficiently far-reaching to be taken up by many leading artists and to overturn the orthodoxies of the period. Likewise, the biomorphism evident in American abstract art of the late 1930s and early 1940s, drawing inspiration from a European ethos and expressionism's dubious political alignments, quickly proved to be an unacceptable face for the dawning American century. The origins of biomorphism are today largely forgotten, and biomorphic is now an adjective only occasionally and simplistically used to denote irregular form languages, such as irregular form languages which evoke organic nature and the shapes of a few recognizable objects, such as pebbles and plants. Arguably, the formal characteristics of biomorphism were so ubiquitous in the visual language of the leading art at the time that the genre failed to achieve a status beyond and above commonplace. Perhaps that's why it's now so easy to assume that the Merz Barn drew inspiration mainly from the features of its immediate environment, and that Schwitter's physical isolation in northern England was matched by a similar isolation from the wider cultural environment. It's inaccurate to assume that because the latent landscape still demonstrates for some the romantic idealisms of William Gilpin's 18th century sensibility, it's inaccurate to assume that the English tradition of the picturesque is one best providing a measure with which to gauge the strengths and weaknesses of Schwitter's late practice, and particularly the Merz Barn. John Elderfield rightly observed that, he said, Schwitter's still held roots and commitments in a German past, and particularly in a pre-industrial and romantic ideal of organic wholeness. This withdrawal to a greener world provided the model for a more authentic life, a restorative terrain. Schwitters did not turn to the new world, as did nearly all his contemporaries, but retreated farther into the old world. Now, one may, however, query Elderfield's subsequent comment that he said Schwitter's existing vocabulary had to be severely ruptured to tell of his new surroundings. I mean, I'd suggest to the contrary, that Schwitter's, in some respects, always a man of his time, sort of fluid and seamless synthesis of lifelong artistic preoccupations and international developments in the visual arts. The Merz Barn especially reveals remarkable consonances with the now largely forgotten biomorphic genre of the 1940s, an area of creativity which was very fashionable at the time, but which also had antecedents consistent with the enthusiasms and zeitgeist informing the onset of Schwitter's artistic career. As Elderfield noted, Schwitters did not, of course, escape to the New World, but retreated further into the familiarities and also privations of the Old World. Perhaps that was a consequence of temperament as much as circumstance. Creative sensibilities were deeply rooted in a European ethos. I mean, one may speculate on Schwitter's further engagement with the biomorphic had he survived, had he lived. By 1947, biomorphism's brief ascendancy as an art form embodying the spirit of the times, that seemed increasingly frail as a consequence of the insecurities of the new atomic age. To be modern, to be a modern artist, finally, meant to be able to respond to the fate of the individual within the chaos and alarm of what seemed to be an imminent Third World War. Jackson Pollock's first all-over paintings in 1950 were to become the cultural commentary on not only contemporary concerns for the integrity of the picture plane, but also modern anxieties. That's to say, depictions of a newfound force of nature, simultaneously powerful but destructive. That's to say, the atom bomb transformed into myth. Thank you very much.